The Subtle Art of Not Defining Culture. Why Culture Cannot Be Built, Captured, or Commanded, Only Grown. By Fred Falloon. We do not define the words that serve us well. Only when they begin to fail do we reach for definition. There are certain words that resist captivity. You can trace their roots, catalogue their meanings, map their usage across time, and still end up none the wiser. They are not broken down so much as lived through. Culture is such a word. This is a fact that rarely deters anyone. On the contrary, the temptation to define, systematize, and legislate the meaning of culture has never been stronger. Politicians invoke it to frame agendas. Academics dissect it in seminars. Corporate campaigns sell it, curate it, celebrate it. Bureaucrats propose programs to foster it. And the word itself, culture, has become a kind of universal garnish, scattered over every initiative, every identity, every slogan in need of borrowed gravitas. But what it refers to, in any definite sense, remains elusive. This elusiveness is not a bug, it is a clue. Culture does not present itself for inspection. It is not like a building, whose structure we can survey and replicate. It is more like air pressure, immeasurable at a glance, but vital and all-encompassing. You feel it in the tempo of speech, in how grief is expressed, in the reverence or flippancy with which elders are treated, in the difference between silence that signals comfort and silence that signals contempt. Culture is not made. It grows, and it grows only under certain conditions. It is not a project. It is a consequence. That is the reason for these essays, not to offer a program, not to construct a philosophy of politics, and certainly not to pile more idle commentary onto the teetering mountain of cultural analysis. The aim is simpler and more dangerous: to clarify a word, to remove from culture the crust of misuse and cliché that has rendered it meaningless, and in doing so, to reveal what we have really lost and what we are unlikely to recover. This loss is not rhetorical. We do not, as a rule, define words that are doing their jobs. Like joints that do not ache, they pass unnoticed. Only when the ligament is torn, only when language fails to cohere with reality, do we reach for definition. And we are reaching. The word culture is now said with increasing urgency, as though its repetition might conjure back what has vanished. The more we speak it, the less it means, and the more desperate our attempts to keep speaking it. That alone should alarm us. Nowhere is this emptiness more obvious than in the phrase culture war. You hear it daily. It is shouted in headlines, woven into the speech of pundits, wielded as both accusation and defense. But what is it really describing? What war? What culture? For all the energy poured into this supposed battle, very little of it touches the lived realities of culture at all. It is a war of gestures over language, symbols, policies, and media narratives. It is a war of moods and mimics, not manners and morals. Its chief concern is not the transmission of meaning across generations, but the speed with which opinions ricochet among people in the same one. What poses as cultural conflict is more often a closed circuit of takes, an accelerating loop of reactions, outrage and posturing, sealed off from memory and blind to inheritance. What we call a culture war today is in truth a war of performances, hyperactive, theatrical, and oddly weightless. It generates friction but no fire, heat without light. It is not a battle for the soul of a people, but a ritualized squabble over optics. One side wants different statues. The other side wants to keep the old ones. Neither side knows how to carve. This theatricality is not incidental. It is characteristic of the age. We live in a moment where the reality of shared life has thinned. The public square has become a stage, and culture has become its scenery. We gesture toward it, drape ourselves in its symbols, but rarely ask what it demands. And the rare few who do are often shouted down by both camps, one of which views culture as regressive baggage, the other as a bundle of consumer preferences and national branding. The results are absurd. We are told that culture can be revived by budget increases, that civilization can be reimagined through education policy, that social reform will not just make us safer or fairer, but will generate culture, as if culture were a byproduct of bureaucracy. These are not honest errors. They are symptoms of a deeper confusion, the belief that culture is something that can be aimed at directly. It is not. You can no more build culture by policy than you can fall asleep by trying. This inflation of the word culture, its swelling beyond all meaning, has coincided with the unmistakable decline of the real thing. And this is no coincidence. A civilization in decay is always loudest about its values. The more our traditions fracture, the more our institutions hollow out, the more we chant the word. It becomes a balm, a deflection, a way of speaking about loss without acknowledging the thing lost. And trailing behind it, always, is the word civilization, its more serious twin. The two now blur into each other, invoked by those who feel, often without knowing why, that something foundational is slipping away. I will not try to fix the boundary between them. I see no need to draw lines between culture and civilization, to slot one under the other in some orderly diagram. Any such effort may satisfy the academic mind, but will do little to help us think. Real speech, like real culture, is less tidy. We feel our way through it. We use one word where it fits, another where it does not. The distinction is fluid because the thing itself is fluid, and to insist otherwise is to mistake the map for the terrain. What matters is not precision for its own sake, but clarity for the sake of action. And clarity begins with humility, the humility to admit that we no longer know what culture is, that our definitions are compensations, that our public rituals mask private confusion. We must begin not by asserting, but by listening. Listening for what is no longer said or can no longer be said, except through borrowed terms and broken forms. And so, having cleared some ground, I propose no definition, only a question. What are the conditions under which culture grows? That will be the subject of the essays to follow. Not ideals, not visions, not designs, but conditions. The soil in which culture might again take root. For culture is not fabricated, it is cultivated. It is what grows when certain things are allowed to settle, deepen, and cohere. When certain rhythms of life are preserved long enough to form memory. When the balance between the universal and the particular, the enduring and the ephemeral, is struck again and again in new but recognizable ways. When that balance is lost, however, when the universal is severed from the particular or the ephemeral drowns out the enduring, the result is not renewal but rupture. And rupture, in time, produces forgetting. Culture thins. The thread frays. We begin to lose not just the content of tradition, but the capacity to carry one at all. At this point, the progressive enters the scene, often with noble intentions, but a misplaced confidence in what can be reconstructed from scratch. To his credit, he is not wrong in one limited sense. If something has been lost, we must go on without it. But he does not stop there. What he usually proposes is more than endurance. It is reinvention. The belief, sometimes stated and sometimes only felt, that the very reforms and upheavals which dismantle the old will somehow give rise to something better in its place. A new civilization suited to new ideals. And perhaps they will. Civilizations do change. Sometimes, under pressure, they shatter. But even when the old gives way to the new, there is no guarantee that what follows will be richer or finer. We assume too easily that what comes next will vindicate what is now being torn down. Yet the truth is that no generation can foresee the world its changes will create. Every movement sets loose a chaos of effects, unintended, misaligned, and irreversible. Even if we could sketch the outward appearance of this future civilization, we could not predict what it would feel like to live inside it. And the people who do will not be us. They will be shaped by it, not the other way around. They will inherit its assumptions like air and carry forward its values, whatever those turn out to be. This is the often overlooked and unspoken cost of transformation, not the loss of institutions alone, or the vanishing of rituals and roles, but the quiet reshaping of the human creature itself. We tend to imagine history as a sequence of systems, each replaced by another, but it is also a sequence of selves. A change in the structure of life brings with it a change in the structure of consciousness. When a society abandons its past, it does not merely forget. It begins to reward forgetting as a productive mechanism, and in doing so, It starts to unmake the kind of person capable of bearing the weight of memory at all. And this, perhaps, is the deeper tragedy. Not only that we may fail to preserve what we inherited, but that we may also succeed in creating something entirely new, only to find it uninhabitable. For there is a limit to what a society can forget before it begins to deform the people who live within it. A civilization that dismantles its own foundations will not merely change its outward form, it will change the kind of human being it produces. Out of such forgetting emerges a figure shaped less by memory than by motion. The self becomes a placeholder, endlessly revised, adapted, rearranged. Identity detaches from inheritance and drifts into improvisation. The past is no longer a reservoir of meaning, but an obstacle to be cleared. The result is not liberation, but hollowness. What this creates is a man of many selves and no center. A man who moves easily between postures, fluent in borrowed styles, quick to signal but unable to stay. His shelf is empty not because he has lost everything, but because he cannot bear to keep anything. He calls this freedom, but it is the freedom of the unrooted. He learns to speak of justice without reverence, of truth without memory, of belonging without place. Continuity itself begins to look like oppression. Permanence begins to feel like violence. The habits that once held a culture together, ritual, restraint, reverence, seem ridiculous to a sensibility trained on disruption. And why would they not? He has been raised in the habit of forgetting, and so even the impulse to remember feels foreign. Such a person cannot build. He can only curate. He can manage impressions but not cultivate forms. He can shift, but he cannot shape. A culture of constant reinvention may dazzle for a time, but it cannot endure. Its children will inherit motion, but not meaning. They will know how to navigate change, but not how to bear it. And in time, they will come to see stability itself as a threat. This is not a future to condemn, only to understand. Because once we see it clearly, we may still have time to choose something else. Not through force, not through engineering, but by remembering what must be preserved, and by having the courage to keep it. This is not a guidebook. There are no formulas here. I do not pretend that by identifying these conditions, we can immediately set about creating them. Quite the opposite. The lesson of all true cultures is that they were never planned. They emerged. And emergence, unlike engineering, is not something we command. That is why any serious inquiry into culture must begin not with ambition, but with attention. Before we can speak of revival or renewal, we must first learn how to observe, closely, quietly, without haste or consolation. We must come to terms with what has already faded, and consider, without sentimentality, how and why it was allowed to fade. This calls for more than nostalgia. It requires a kind of disciplined patience, a willingness to acknowledge what we might prefer not to see, that for culture to arise, certain conditions must be present. Not because we desire them, but because they have always been there when culture has taken root. The soil matters, and while we cannot choose it, we can choose whether to care for it or to abandon it in the hope that something might still grow from dust. To speak plainly about culture today is not easy. It unsettles. It risks misunderstanding. And yet, if we are to be honest, we must admit that real culture, the kind that endures, that binds generations and grants shape to a common life, is never neutral. It does not cater to every preference, nor can it flourish in a space scrubbed clean of tension and tradition. It requires memory. It involves limits. It grows within forms, not apart from them. It draws strength from distinction, not erasure. These are not easy recognitions. We live in a time animated by good intentions, to include, to equalize, to liberate. These are noble impulses, but they have also led us to forget that not all cultural forms are equally sustaining, that continuity often depends on structures that resist simplification. We have come to associate inheritance with exclusion, rootedness with restriction, difference with injustice. Yet culture has never grown in abstraction. It has always been local, particular, and shaped by constraints as much as ideals. But if we cannot accept these truths, if we cannot kick our addiction to equality, abstraction, and innovation, then we must also stop pretending to care about culture. To care about culture while rejecting the preconditions of its existence is like caring about wine while salting the vineyard. If you cannot abide the idea of class, ritual, locality, religion, or tradition, that is your right. But do not speak of culture, not to force silence on ourselves, but to remain sincere. Speak instead of entertainment or politics or branding. That would at least be honest. The only honest ambition left to us, I believe, is to understand how culture once grew and to ask whether anything like it might grow again. We cannot summon it by decree, nor accelerate its return with funding or reform. But we can learn to see the conditions in which it once took root, and whether such conditions might still be allowed to exist. Perhaps we cannot restore what has been lost, but we can refuse to deepen the forgetting and incentives the one-dimensional man. We can resist the habits and reflexes that make culture impossible, and in doing so, we may preserve a clearing, however small, in which something vital could return. If we are quiet, if we are steady, if we abandon the illusion of controlling outcomes, then culture may one day reappear, not because we summoned it, but because we stopped getting in its way.